as is usual, if you want to put a question or make a comment, you just identify yourself, please. And if you have the good fortune to represent an organisation, you might state who it is they happen to be. So the first is Dan O'Brien, and then I'll come to Paul Gillespie. So Dan.
From the Irish Times newspaper, how do you feel a bailout for Portugal would impact discussions on the changes to the euro area framework over the next month?
So Spain and Portugal influencing events over the course of the next month?
I don't really think it would have a huge influence for two reasons. First, I think markets and also politicians or economists, political decision makers, not only in Germany but elsewhere, have more or less, to use market speak, priced in the likelihood that this is going to happen. And the second reason is that it could be done within the framework that we currently have of the EFSF. So it would not require, in Germany at least, another vote in Bundestag. And thereby it would be, quote unquote, almost a technical affair and not so much a political affair. So I think if this was going to happen, obviously there would be talk about it, and those who are the die-hard anti-Europeans in Germany would use it as a further argument for pointing out that they were always right on everything they had said against the euro. But it wouldn't really change the quality of the debate. Very unlike a Spanish case. If Spain needed the rescue of the EFSF, that would be a big change, because then likelihood is that, first of all, we would be talking about sums that would not be comparable to the sums that we've been talking about so far, and that may also require funding that goes beyond what is currently at least agreed. So I think that would really be a major change and could lead to difficulties, political difficulties, requiring votes in parliaments in Germany and elsewhere. But Portugal, I don't think so.
Dan, do you want to supplement? No. Okay. Paul, have you got the microphone? It's Paul Gillespie there.
Paul Gillespie. Yes, member of the Institute. To what extent is the Eurozone crisis seen in Germany as a banking crisis, as distinct from a budgetary consolidation crisis? If it's a banking crisis, the Competitiveness Pact is addressing the wrong question, it seems to me. And secondly, what about the question of German interests? Is there a strong constituency saying, notwithstanding the U-turns, that there's still a strong interest in Germany to be involved in the Eurozone? The Eurozone is in Germany's interest. And what, incidentally, does the SPD opposition say about the various points that you're making? Is it part of this consensus, or is it saying something different? Thank you.
Banking crisis. If you're an outside observer, especially, I mean, I as probably most of you, read the English language FT, in which very eloquently yesterday my colleague Wolfgang Proissl made the point that he had the impression that Merkel was sort of fighting a crisis in a parallel world. And he is convinced that it's a banking crisis and not a debt or deficit crisis. I think he is probably right, to a large extent at least. But you would be struck in Germany, it's not a huge point that is raised. In Germany, it is a portrait. Actually, the Greek case is, despite the fact that the crises in Ireland and Greece are very dissimilar, is taken as a template for all the crises going on throughout the Eurozone. And so many people think, excuse me, many people think that Merkel's proposals are quite sensible. So the banking crisis hypothesis is not shared by many people. If you look at the figures, the exposures that German banks have in the various either crisis countries or potential crisis countries, it's quite obvious that their exposure is amongst the biggest, with the French and the British. And that, given the shaky state of at least parts of the German banking landscape, especially the public or semi-public Landesbanken and Sparkassen, being vulnerable there would mean that there would be a further real banking crisis in Germany. It's not something that is part of the political debate. It's astonishing, but I think it's a fact. So Wolfgang Münchau's thesis is shared outside of Germany, but not so much inside in Germany. Could you remind me of the other question, please?
About German interests in the Eurozone.
Yes.
Attitude of the opposition.
Yeah. I did not mention when I talked about Greece and all that, that I think one thing that Merkel singularly lacked during the Greek crisis is not so much technical decisions that she took or didn't take, but that she never explained to the German public why, in the end, she was doing what she was doing. At least she did not explain it until it happened, and afterwards she tried to explain it, but she was very late. In February, March, April, you really have to look for, you could call it visionary European speeches in which she was trying to paint the big picture of why are we doing this. My personal impression is that it was tactical, that she knew that it was the opposite of a vote winner in the context of the regional elections in North Rhine-Westphalia. But I think it was a big policy mistake because she lost anyway. She wasn't considered to be credible. And secondly, I think a lot of political capital was destroyed in those months leading up to this weekend in May, which made it all the more difficult afterwards. And afterwards, she did start explaining this. You have to give her credit for that. She did start explaining this very eloquently. And in her New Year's speech, an important part of her, it's sort of tradition to have a 5 to 10 minutes New Year's speech by the German Chancellor on December 31st. Quite prominently, the role Europe and especially the Eurozone and the survival of the Eurozone is playing for German interests. She very eloquently explained that. But I think she has, by being passive on that in the first half of the year, created a political landscape which is a lot less receptive to those arguments. So intellectually, the arguments are being made, but I think big parts of the German public are no longer ready to listen to them. And that is a serious problem. I think that is, in a way, reflected by the polls that I showed, in which you have a skeptical, in some cases even hostile attitude towards the EU in general and the Eurozone in particular. And I think it's going to be extremely difficult to change that. Once you have this bad atmosphere, to elevate it to a higher level. I mean, Britain certainly is a case which is almost a caricature, but it is impossible in Britain to talk in a positive manner about the Europe. This is not the case in Germany. I'm not saying this is now the case in Germany. But I think we are on a path towards a rather destructive discussion atmosphere on EU and Eurozone issues in Germany, which is dangerous. And when I was doing my research in the first half of last year for this paper that you mentioned that came out with Bruegel, I talked to politicians and I talked to advisors to senior politicians who told me that they fear that events in the first half of last year have created a political atmosphere that could be exploited by a political party, sort of single issue anti-European or anti-Euro or pro-Denmark party, provided they have a charismatic politician, which they don't have for the moment. If you had a politician, if you know a little bit, follow a little bit German domestic politics, there was a very charismatic SPD politician, Oskar Lafontaine, who then ran off and decided to join the communist left. And he is undisputably a charismatic politician. If you had a politician of that caliber standing for an anti-EU, anti-Euro party, the people I talked to said they would be in a position to make 15% or something like that, being part of the German landscape and changing the landscape. as has been already the case in a lot of European countries where anti-EU populism is successful electorally. So I think that is, I mean, all of this is hypothesis, and I hope it doesn't happen, but it's, since we're talking about this, I think it's something that may have been created by the political management of the Greek crisis, which I think had very big shortcomings.
Now, Wolfgang, we have a big problem. There are so many hands going up offering to put questions to that I think we'll get out of here about 5:15 if we stay here much longer. So what I'm going to suggest is that we might take questions in groups of 3,
Sure.
and that you might compress the answer.
I'll do my best.
Because the last man on the list is the president of the Institute, Gareth Fitzgerald, and he will have to get the opportunity to put a question. So I'm going to take 3 distinguished economists here. Okay, we'll start. You are, okay.
Pat McArdle, member of the Institute. Just a quick question. Looking at what emanated from Berlin over the past year, one could be forgiven for thinking that Merkel has no economic advisors whatsoever. Yet suddenly a relatively obscure figure pops up and is now to be president of the Bundesbank. What's going on?
To Brendan, say who you are.
I'm Brendan Lynch. I'm a member of the Institute. I have 2 questions. One, do you think that Germany will pretty soon agree to the new fund ESFFR to be allowed to purchase European state government bonds? And secondly, quite a different one, just looking globally, because we always think in terms of Europe. I mean, Goldman Sachs was its incestuous relationship with the American government and the American Federal Reserve had a lot to do with the global financial crisis. And yet you're promoting a former Goldman Sachs guy as president of the ECB. I mean, this would be an extraordinary triumph for what is called in financial markets the vampire squid.
Ronan Tynan, a member of the Institute. I'd like to thank you for a fascinating presentation. But I also read your paper, actually, and I found that particularly bleak, and I was hoping to get some optimism today. So I came in here in a weakened state, and you finished me off with that presentation. So really, my question is, can we be optimistic? Like you mentioned, for example, the leadership on the rise who were born in the 50s and 60s. They really see Europe as just another instrument of policy. They don't have the same emotional attachment. So, I mean, the reason I would respectfully suggest to the chairman that Chancellor Merkel is the de facto president of Europe, as you've made the point in your paper, is because Germany is the last woman standing economically at the moment. It is the power of the moment, and therefore we have to defer to Germany, because if the Germans don't pay, we're really up the creek without whatever. And I just want to ask you, I mean, could you flesh out some optimistic scenario? For example, there have been some SPD politicians who have written some articles which suggest they understand why the euro is of immense value to the Germans. Yeah, I know that. I'll just finish on that point. Just on that, I mean, look to you're obviously so expert in the German political scene. Perhaps you could maybe give us something to hope for there. Thank you.
Happy pills at the moment, and we share your feeling. Now, Wolfgang.
So no economic advisor to Merkel. Merkel does not have I think it's not unfair to say that she doesn't have a huge economic understanding, and she probably say that herself. But she's a scientist. She is not scared by figures or formulas. On the opposite, she likes that. But I think one of the things that really upset her during the crisis, especially in the beginning, was that she never had the impression of grasping what was happening. And she wasn't the only one. There were lots of European leaders who were in a similar position. And she felt, quite to the contrary to the public impression, she felt extremely well advised by Jens Weidmann, who is now going to be the Bundesbank president. Anecdotally, given that Germany so far has been doing rather well, has come out of the crisis quickly, and the economy is doing well, actually those in Germany who were defending the advices that she was getting from Weidmann, and there's another influential figure, Asmussen, and also the Bundesbank president himself was very instrumental in solving or in helping in the crisis. They say that the Anglo-Saxon, the FT campaigns, Martin Wolf and Wolfgang München, all those people, weren't really proven right, because Germany is not doing so badly. So she does not have the impression of being ill-advised on economic policy issues. But I realize that outside of Germany, many people think that this is not economic advice what she's getting from those people. On the bonds buying program, so far the German government, as far as I'm aware of, has not taken an official line, but has let it be known that they're skeptical. But I don't think there's an official quote or statement by either Schäuble or Merkel saying they either agree or disagree with that. However, I think in the European negotiations they will be under pressure to agree with that, because it would be consistent with the traditional and very strongly felt German opposition to the ECB buying government bonds. And one could imagine that sort of a deal could be that the ECB ceases to buy them and the EFSF is taking over that role. I think one indication for this, there's a certain likelihood that this may happen, is that Bundesbank yesterday published its monthly report and featured this question, and very strongly worded comments, strongly worded for a publication that is normally rather academic, opposed the EFSF buying bonds on the grounds that they say this is inconsistent with what we agreed in October 2010 and December 2010 when we created the EFSF. It also decreases the pressure on the countries to do their homework, and it's not something that we would endorse. They did that, and the economic sections, I myself wrote a story on that yesterday, and my colleagues did as well. So I think they are probably feeling that this is the government will be under pressure to do that and may accept to do that. So they are already creating an opposition to that. Draghi and Goldman Sachs. Obviously, Draghi was at Goldman Sachs for a number of years. But I would be against, I don't know what in German, there's a nice word, Sippenhaft. How do you say that in English? Do you know? Pardon? Tribal. Yeah, sort of being a tribal capture. Just because of the fact that he was part of Goldman Sachs doesn't, in my view, disqualify him from running for ECB. If it was proven that he was involved in murky business with Greece and that there was anything reprehensible that he was involved in or had knowledge of, then I would consider it an argument against him. So far, I haven't heard that. I think it was looked into. The issue is a very big moral issue in France, and I trust that if Mr. Sarkozy had arguments showing that Mr. Draghi was involved in anything that would be reprehensible, he would have let it be known. On optimism, it's difficult.
That's sufficient. We're going here. Professor Jukes here. I'm going to take this group here. Yeah. Okay.
Alan Jukes, a member of the Institute. Less said about the rest, the better, I suppose. I have to agree with the last comment, incidentally, about tribalism. I mean, the fact that Brendan belonged to the Labour Party doesn't make him a bad economist, by any means. Take your pick. I'd like to ask Wolfgang to comment on this. An action that deals with a crisis is effective if it's taken quickly. I think the lesson from the European reaction to the Greek crisis is that something that might have been adequate in itself became inadequate because it took so long to put in place. Is that not the danger that we have now? Without going on at length about it, the Irish problem that is weighing with the Eurozone at the moment is one that has been far too protracted. 2 years from crash to resolution legislation is rather too long. It may become a bigger problem for the Eurozone. It certainly will be if it's followed by a Portuguese and a Spanish problem. Is there not an existential argument for the Eurozone, which is so important to Germany, to take action quickly, whatever kind of action it is? It may be the Munchau line, it may be the Stiglitz line, it may be any one of 3 or 4 different lines. But the essential thing is that it be done quickly. Otherwise, it'll be too late for it to have any effect.
Okay, thank you.
Czech ambassador, thank you very much for your presentation. There are many voices now in the whole EU around, which are blaming Germany and particularly Angela Merkel for some authoritarian approach, etc. But I can see rather a huge disappointment on the side of the German citizens, so with the EU, that they are somehow feeling so then they are blamed and somehow let down instead of getting some kind of understanding from other Europeans, because when the solidarity is now highly expected, so then it should be applied also toward the Germans. And my question is, how long would you assume may last some disappointment of the Germans in terms of EU lack of solidarity with them?
Right behind you to Joseph Brosnan, former Director General of the
With 6 more state elections pending, Germany is going to be in pretty much constant election mode for the next 7 or 8 months. Chancellor Merkel is going to have to speak to an internal audience for that purpose to try and ensure her party doesn't suffer too badly in the elections. At the same time, there are big decisions to be taken at European level, which will be unpopular in Germany and which she will be crucial to. How is she going to balance those two things? And in particular, is there a risk that things that she may say to a domestic audience may undermine some of the progress at European level by spooking bondholders again?
No.
Concerning quick action and the lack of it, I wouldn't. I mean, here I think I would be cautiously optimistic in the sense that if you compare the extremely tortuous way how we got to Greece, the Greek decision, and the setting up of the EFSF, and to the decision on Ireland, I think it's 2 different worlds. It's right. If we have to create something new, and it has to be approved by national parliaments, there have to be national debates and agreement amongst all the member states. I think it's almost by definition going to be that's the European way. It's dangerous if it's a crisis like the one that we are having at the moment, because this time I think the weekend, May 8 to 10, at least that it's being portrayed like that, was the weekend when the Eurozone was in front of the decision of continuing to exist or not, and it found the decisions that allowed it to continue to exist. But it could also, the danger of this process is that you also have irrational and erratic events coming up in the political negotiations that could have derailed the process and could have led to no decision on that weekend. And then if the markets were, as they were described, Thursday, Friday preceding that weekend, it could have well been that the Eurozone would have collapsed on Monday or Tuesday afterwards. At least that is what they say at the ECB, for example, in order to justify the bond buying program. Now we have this fund in place that can react rather quickly. And so I think, as I tried to say earlier, a smaller scale new case, such as Portugal, would be manageable and also be addressed quickly. If it requires a new framework with new national votes, then it may be long, especially if a domestically weakened chancellor, and she's likely to be weakened in the months to come, has to have, and this is coming to the other questions about the contradiction between national audiences and European necessities. If she has to take decisions in a context where her political survival may be at stake at home, I don't know how she's going to react. I mean, people say that Kohl, in a way, sacrificed his re-election in 1997 to pushing through the euro. Not sure it's entirely accurate, and after having been chancellor for 16 years, it's perhaps easier to do that than if you're in your second term. But in a way, it certainly contributed to his defeat. I don't know how Merkel would react if that was the question that she was asked politically, question between being re-elected and taking the necessary decision in Europe. And the lack of solidarity, I think it's many Germans have the feeling that obviously it is being reported in German media what is being said about Germany and about its supposed egotism and Chancellor Merkel being authoritarian and all that is being reported, and I don't think it enhances love with German voters for Europe. That's the feeling is, to put it quite crudely, we are paying for all this, and on top of that we're being insulted. So this is difficult to turn this in a positive narrative, and I think politicians will be hard pressed to do that. But nevertheless, I think they should try. And they should start earlier than they did in the Greek crisis. I think the other argument is if you let the debate go to a low level, it's very difficult to raise it domestically.
Okay. Now, just here in the front row.
John Cronin, McCann Fitzgerald. I wanted to know, did you accept the second thesis of Wolfgang Proissl in yesterday's Financial Times when he said that the German misguided narrative was a result of 20 years of political narrative, both left and right, that you can run a monetary union with a simple set of rules, and if there's a problem, it's a fiscal problem, and therefore austerity is always the answer. If you do accept that thesis, how or can you change that narrative or understanding within Germany?
Right behind you, Don Thornhill.
Thanks very much indeed. Don Thornhill, member of the Institute. Improved export competitiveness has been an important part of the German economic recovery. To what extent is there an analysis in Germany that breakup of the Eurozone would lead to the German currency becoming, certainly in the short to medium term, a safe haven currency and thereby an appreciating currency, which would of course have a negative effect on export competitiveness?
Coming right up here to the front.
Well, thank you. Well, thank you very much for the instructive presentation you have had. And I happened to live for a short while in Berlin back in time in 1998, where I had the opportunity to attend a series of seminars on European integration and enlargement. And remember back in time that there was a thought and a recurrent phrase in the mouth of German politicians is we'd rather export stability to this part of the world instead of importing instability. So in the process of time, what do you think, given the mood, the economic and political mood now for the time being, do you think that you will say to these newly states in the European Union to wait until to have order in the European House pending to have them in the Eurozone? Thank you very much.
Huh.
The narrative in the, I noted down narrative, and I tend to forget the questions. Narrative in the EU only, I'm sorry, the first question I haven't.
John. Sorry, the question was whether if you believe that
oh yeah, fiscal, yeah, right, yeah, right, yeah. I think the
German view from the original basic program for enlargement was that you needed parallel progress on the fiscal along with the monetary.
Okay.
Well, initially, right. Initially, Initially, when the negotiations for the Maastricht Treaty started, Chancellor Kohl went into the negotiations with a sort of two-track approach. On the one hand, EMU, and on the other hand, political union. The problem back then, and I think it's consistent, but the problem back then was EMU, you'd had preparatory work for almost 30 years, and you had lots of pre-planning on which you could draw, where you could enter substantive political negotiations very quickly when the treaty was negotiated. The same was not at all true on political union, which was extremely ill-defined. So a meaningful political integration in parallel to monetary integration was dropped in the very beginning because they realized that there just wasn't the groundwork that had been done to conduct such negotiations. I think that the German error in thinking about this was that they basically thought all the other Eurozone countries would have a German approach to the rules that were set out in the way that they would take them seriously. Whereas when I was a correspondent in Paris, for example, when this was discussed, In Paris, the insistence on stability and the political necessity for Germans to have the Stability and Growth Pact was seen as sort of a typically German neurosis that one had to accept, but would not take horribly seriously. And I would suspect that quite a few other member states had a similar approach. On top of that, German government, the Schröder government, destroyed the credibility of the rules that the preceding government had built by breaching them on the first opportunity that came up in 2002 or 2003 when Germany's deficit was above the 3%. So I think there is just a very different way of thinking about rules, and then Germany, which should have, in order to enforce them, showed the example in 2002, 2003 by accepting a procedure by Brussels and perhaps also sanctions or get the deficit rather quickly down. They did the opposite, and they contributed to the lack of credibility of those rules. I think in the end, it is probably necessary to have fiscal union together with monetary union, because so far the rules-based approach does not seem to work. But I think it's, at the moment, impossible. You have to, in this case, either vote, obviously, or even have a referendum, which is also something that the Constitutional Court created, the possibility of referenda on issues like this in Germany. This is something which would not be won. Just to put it very plainly, it would not be won, a referendum on this. Exports and the mark becoming a safe haven currency if the Eurozone broke up. It's likely to happen. Perhaps for you it may sound bizarre, but you have serious people in Germany saying it wouldn't be all that bad. Because they say that's also what happened in the, 60s, 70s, and 80s. It supplied for permanent competitive pressure on the companies, and it did them well. It's true that it's sort of like a permanent fitness club for them, which is now not there. So you have people who say this would be a major headache, but you have also other people who say it's going to happen, but actually it would be quite welcome. The last question I escaped. Oh, if new member states would, new member states would be welcome. I think there's one argument that for Merkel would be a potential argument for that. You know that there is now, I didn't talk about this, within the Competitiveness Pact, she has adopted sort of a French concept with the economic government, which would comprise only the Eurozone countries. One of the arguments Merkel always made against this concept, off the record, when she was talking off the record, I'm talking on the record, was that in a European economic governance with only the Eurozone countries, Germany was always in the minority because there were only the 4 or 5 countries of the former D-Mark bloc which would be supporting Germany because they had similar economic policy beliefs, whereas the other ones would be voting against them. So they would always be outvoted. Whereas they feel that the Scandinavians and some of the Eastern and Central European countries, like the Czech Republic or Poland, are a lot closer in economic philosophy terms, and stability policies are a lot more accepted and part of their economic policy thinking than is the case in France, for example, or many Southern European countries. So I don't know what the decision would be, but I think that would be sort of tactical motives would be part of the decision, part of the equation.
Thank you. The last comment, Gareth, just wait for the...
Struck by the fact that both in your remarks and in the subsequent discussion, the European Commission was not mentioned, or the European Community method, which has been absolutely crucial to the survival of the community's success. Now, there are 2 aspects of this. The first is that, in principle, it is highly undesirable that we move to an intergovernmental process and abandon the community method, without which the community would not have done as well as it has. And say, apart from the general principle, which we have adhered to very strongly here, very supportive of, there is concern that an intergovernmental process initiated by two heads of state, particularly Chancellor Merkel, may not, by not employing the skills of the European Commission. Okay, the European Commission made mistakes before. The growth pact was badly designed. They've learned from that. They have considerable skills now, technically on a solution. And there's a real concern here among some economists that anything coming out of this at heads of government level will simply not be competently organized. So how is it that the European Commission has been totally ignored in all this?
It's a very good point. And I think you are entirely right. Many people in Germany, if you ask them, even policy people, would not even really know what the community method is today, whereas 20 years ago it was something. Today you have the impression that the only ones who are talking about the community method in Brussels are the Belgians. That's at least the impression you get when you are in Brussels. And in Germany, it was part of the discourse, like, for example, when Fischer was talking about Europe, or the Kohl government as well. It was very much part of that, because they realized how important, on the first level, it is because they have the technical know-how, but on the second level also how important it is because it is reassuring for the smaller member states who find the community institutions, especially the Commission, as being the guardian of their interests, which they cannot push through but with their own weight. As it happens, relations between the Commission and German governments, since it started with Kohl, but it became increasingly visible with Schröder, who publicized that as well, have deteriorated dramatically. Merkel, in the beginning, tried to build a constructive relationship with the Commission and also personally with Commission President Barroso, but relations really soured over a couple of issues where she considered that he disregarded of her interests, and she also considers that he owes her something politically because he is there, in part at least, because she put him there. But the relations soured. And today, I think I wouldn't exaggerate to say that the Commission is, in the Chancellery, considered to be a liability and a risk. And the effort is to ring-fence it and not to get it into the game. And I think the Competitiveness Pact is the best example of that. That's no coincidence that there's no role for the Commission. It's purposeful.